Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This is a conversation with Matt Minahan, leader of the Minahan Group, an organization strategy, design, and development consultancy. Among his many attributes for this conversation, Matt was also a student of Peter Vale, and I look forward always when I speak with his former students to hear Peter Vale's stories. And you'll hear some today. Matt has a lot of insights into practice, and particularly the practice of organization development. Matt Minahan. Well, folks, Matthew Minahan is joining this conversation today. And like all the others I've mentioned, since Peter was no longer able physically to join us, this is in the spirit of Peter Vale. His belief in the value of conversation, which wasn't necessarily featured per se in our podcast when we were talking, but think about it. That's how he and I learned so much together. That's how Matt and I are going to learn together now. Matt, Peter had a way of thinking about practice. Perhaps it'd be fair to you to give you a taste of that before we begin. Peter's initially wrote, "Practice is the conscious ability, fairly consistently, to produce intended results, and to do so across a range of circumstances, and to do so while growing and changing oneself," underline the word self, "to meet the changing circumstances in which one practice exists." So if you think about how that essentially describes your career, your long career, you were always working toward intended results. You certainly had a number of changing circumstances and ranges for yourself personally, as well as for the organizational members you were helping. And I think, again, the key to our thinking and why we are focusing on the individual in these conversations is one is always growing and changing oneself as long as you have that intention to be a developing practitioner. Mm-hmm. So here you are pretty far along in your career. Are you still developing, Matt Minahan? And if so, how?
So, that's a lifelong project. I talk to my students and my clients about the capacity to be a critical thinker. And the capacity to be a critical thinker is a function of being able to see myself in action and to examine my beliefs and assumptions and to even be in touch with what do I believe about myself? And are those beliefs serving me? And what do I believe about other people? And are those beliefs serving me in my work? And what do I believe about the world? And how are those beliefs serving me? Because whatever I believe about myself or others in the world is what's going to drive my behavior. And it's my behavior that's going to drive results in the world. And so stitching together results, which Peter talks about in his definition, behavior, which he mentions, and self, which he mentions. His conception of progress is exactly aligned with kind of my own thinking, and is the source for kind of my own thinking as I think about lifelong learning. I think about critical thinking, and I think about constantly being a student of myself, my actions, and the results that I get. So it is great comfort to hear you read Peter's definition as we begin, because he was so central to my thinking and my formation as an OD consultant, but also as a citizen of the world.
I think you'd very much appreciate both of those descriptions of yourself. He definitely had, among his many loves, the practice of organization development, and you could probably talk a bit about some of his contributions there. But being a citizen in the world, the range of circumstances and changing contexts, the white water, if you will, that Peter wrote about and talked about often throughout his time.
Mm-hmm.
One of my many regrets that Peter had, his health didn't keep him with us any longer, was that he would have been appalled, fascinated, hopeful, scared. He would have had so many emotions and thoughts about what's going on through this period of the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
because it's literally changed every kind of practice that he and I could possibly have thought of, and perhaps you.
Sure.
So his point, to your point of being lifelong learning, is, well, the bad news is things that worked quite well in order to achieve results for most kinds of practitioners
Mm-hmm.
aren't going to work that well anymore. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is, for those who believe in themselves as learners,
Mm-hmm.
they're going to figure out a way to get through this and perhaps even be more relevant on the other side.
I
So a
think that's
couple of thoughts
true.
there.
Yeah, I think that's true. If there ever were a time that the world needed what we have to offer, this is that time. Here's my concern about the field, and my fear about us in the world in the future. And that is, we have done a magnificent job of bounding ourselves, keeping a strong boundary between us and the business of the system. Now, we're so focused on the social system, we're so focused on the behavioral system, that I think too many of us are reluctant, allergic, repulsed by basic income dynamics, basic business dynamics. And so I press my students hard all the time to understand the funding sources and the dynamics of the funding sources and the income dynamics and the overall expenditure priorities. What's the overall budget? What's the sources of income for any system that they're entering? And this is true
Anyone?
even if they're entering even if they're entering a project team, a
Mm-hmm.
small 10, 12 person project team, or you're doing team building in the finance department or something like that. Even in those situations, I encourage my students to get fluent in what are the dynamics of the business. And what I find is that many organizations just require that in order for a consultant to be credible. And so my concern is that too many of our practitioners today are allergic to leaning in, or don't feel competent to lean in, or just afraid to ask the questions along those lines. And and frankly, if you can't be fluent in those topics, you're not going to be valuable or useful in this world, particularly as it stands right now, and as it's going to stand for, because the priorities in the system are not going to be how do people get along. The priorities in the system are not going to be what's the teamwork like in the kitchen. The priorities in the system are going to be how do we revive our businesses, and that's just not a domain where I think many of our OD practitioners are skilled. And so I have a fear that being a weakened body ourselves, that this virus is going to take advantage of us and our future, particularly if we're not prepared to meet our client businesses where they are as businesses.
I agree with you. And I think that would, now we've learned, be true of churches, of nonprofits, of
Mm-hmm.
all the different institutions that are, they're
Correct.
revenue dependent. And I doubt there's anyone isn't. I think I feel that, what you're saying, and I've seen it. And we who taught organizational behavior in business schools were often, as Peter has written about and talked about in our podcast, pushed out to a margin. The soft guys, you've heard that, I'm sure, many.
Correct. Well, even at American University, I mean, I've been part of two programs that have closed down in the last 20 years. I taught at Johns Hopkins, where the OD program was in the School of Professional Studies
Mm-hmm.
and got acquired by the business school and could not produce the rate of return with the high volume that the business school demanded, and so they closed the program. And that's just recently happening now at American University for the same reason. I mean, we've never lost money, but we haven't made the kind of money that the university required. And this virus weakened the university substantially financially. And so programs that aren't generating the required rates of return are getting a hard look at, and we did not survive our hard look.
I'm awfully sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
I will expose a belief, probably a bias, and that is at this time, in order to regenerate and gain business, you're going to have a whole lot more acumen about people, how people are motivated, how to align their practices. There's going to be an awful lot about what the organizational realm of thought could offer, if in fact maybe not separate, but if somehow or another they could be more closely articulated. Because one of the things that I've taught and worked on is the issue of innovation, and the source of innovation being the creative individual. What's happened over years is a lot of creative individuals have pulled themselves out of bigger businesses and tried to start on their own because they feel so encumbered by those who don't really understand the human aspect of their organizations all that much. So maybe one of the things that'll come through all of the smoke and fire will be hopefully some recognition that business is exquisitely human. It's a human enterprise. It has an aspect of that enterprise which has to do with acquiring and using income. And yet when you finally get over to the hump, which is my quality management training over the years, you've got to discover customers and find out what they value and then creatively produce what they value. So it comes back to people again. So it is an interesting paradox in a way, that while programs are receding because they don't seem to be able to make money, and because they're not about money, perhaps they are more than anyone knows. So I'll get off my soapbox.
No, listen, I think that's exactly right. I think Peter would look at the state of our OD programs, and I think he would despair.
Yeah,
he wouldn't recognize them from when he was teaching in them in the 90s and the 00s, 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 00s. And part of it is just because we don't have career faculty, and so all of our programs are staffed with adjuncts, and so we don't have faculty doing research to advance the field. So the only research that's going on is basically dissertation research, and we know that it is long form, extended lines of research over decades that actually bring advances to any new body of knowledge, and we don't have the benefit of that. You know, when our program at American University, the Masters of Science in Organization Development, was started in 1980, it was taught mostly by behavioral scientists in the School of Public Affairs. And today they're all policy people, they're economists. There are no behavioral scientists that we would recognize from our world. And so our OD schools become more and more marginalized and become exceptions to the rule rather than the center of gravity in any of these programs.
Well put. I can think of the people that Peter has talked about from Rollersberger. I never pronounce it well. Folks that he worked with when he moved from his MBA at Harvard and was invited into this brave new doctoral program, which called itself organizational behavior. I guess Rollersberger worked hard and struggled with that term, but they also incorporated the organization design, development, all the other features. And there were some very, very smart people who did what you just said, who did the long line of thinking, wrote beautifully. Probably their research wouldn't have been accepted in today's very tight definition of, if it don't do data, it don't do, you know.
Sure.
Really thoughtful, lots of, like Peter's writing, lots of wonderful essays and real theorizing, you know, true theorizing.
creating new knowledge. Ed Shine, Chris
Ed
Ardress.
Shine. Yep.
These are they're both theorists, and there are probably dozens more who were paid to think, and it was their thinking, not their research. It was their thinking that has advanced our field. Um, Now, here's what here's what I would like. If we had 25 more years as a field, I think we ought to invest a ton of time on how do we monetize, or how do we not monetize it, how do we calculate the rate of return on an OD investment. We have no language, we have no metrics, we have no tools to say, spend $75,000 on this program and I can save you 225 down the road. We have no capacity to either predict our own costs or anticipate what they might save to our clients. And if we can't engage in that conversation, 50 years ago, before managers were particularly smart, we were an easy sell. But today, these managers are our clients are very savvy, and they want to see the rate of return. And we can't talk that language at all.
It's interesting because back to the working way of thinking about practice, intended results. You may have intended results as an OD practitioner and consultant, but what I hear you saying is that if they aren't matching up with the kinds of results that matter to the people who would employ you for an engagement, it's a one-hand clapping. So that is an interesting challenge. Have you taken any cuts at it at all in your own work?
No, I mean, when I was on the board of the OD network, we had some conversations with the International Society for Performance Improvement, and they calculate things, they count things, and they, we learned a lot from them. Went to a couple of their conferences, had some of their speakers come to us, but that's not the center of our field. The center of our field is values-based human interaction around inclusion, around diversity, around the social system, and the people who bring our hearts to that work are not the people who sit down with an adding machine or a calculator and can estimate the rate of return on an OD investment. And so,
yeah, I can't even imagine the tool or someone would invent to try to get someone to tell you if they have shifted in their outlook on life or anything else that you're working on in terms of the values anchor that you guys work with. It's ineffable. It's so ineffable that it should not be put in inside a slide ruler, showing you my age here. And I think Peter would be fascinated with what you and I are saying to each other right now, because he would not agree with you or disagree with you on this. He would ponder it. That's because right. He would probably very much like to see 25 years more of people who prepared themselves, underlined right. selves, to be this kind of presence among others, particularly if they want to do it for a living, teaching it and writing about it. So your sense is now the research that would have been necessary to get underway around that issue of ROI is not necessarily happening.
No, we don't have career scholars in the field anymore. Our programs are all a half-time director and 10 or 12 adjuncts. So, from that perspective, I think we've got some structural challenges in the field that are going to be very hard to overcome.
Go ahead.
As you were talking there, I was thinking, we mentioned Chris and we mentioned Ed Shine. Jerry Harvey and Peter Vail are in that exact same boat. I mean, these were not people who were doing research. There's no quantitative anything behind managing as a performing art or the Abilene paradox. These were people thinking great thoughts that influenced. And the other two cool things about both those guys, Jerry and Peter, is that they both were skilled educators, particularly in the use of metaphor.
Oh, yes.
And that's one of the things that I so deeply appreciate, particularly Peter, but also with Jerry, because I had both of them in my own graduate studies, um, is that they were both masters at bringing forth metaphors.
From here,
Meditative.
on the
Yeah,
spot,
exactly.
as he was my teacher, and I was always amazed at that.
Yeah.
And in the other part of that, and maybe you saw it too. I never knew Jerry. I just read about him and heard Peter talk about him. But Peter could look about in the middle of a class and find a
Something, an object,
something
right?
that he could, and then he would weave. Not he would weave. He'd say, "Let's weave,
Yeah.
together. Let's weave some meaning into this. Take it all the way as far as you can. Come back in 20 minutes and debrief." Remember that?
I do. In
And
fact,
it worked.
I'll tell you a quick story. He was supposed to teach in my doctoral program. He was supposed to be teaching. This was right around the time he doing his work on spirituality. So this was the early 90s. And we had a cohort of 12 students in the program, and there were two directors and co-directors, and they had been at each other's throats during this whole time. And on the Friday morning, when we sat down around the table with Peter at the head, the two co-directors got into a spat, and it was, that's probably understating it. Got into a conflict, and the one co-director threw the other co-director out of the room. He being a big man, she being a slight woman, had no recourse but to leave. So, and there was a split in the cohort. Half the cohort lined up with the man, half the cohort lined up with the woman. And so the remaining director made his announcements and left the room, leaving Peter with this big mess. And so Peter took that, used that as the object. He didn't need a cup, he used that as the object. And he spent the entire day with us in almost tea group fashion, exploring what had happened, how we saw it, working the ladder of inference here. So what was the data? What did it mean to you? And how is it that you saw it this way and you saw it that way? And even getting beyond that down into the kind of the
into how did it make you feel? Yeah,
he was just magnificent at acting in the moment and dealing with whatever was in the room. And I'm a dean, a T group dean for NTL, and so every couple of years I dean a T group somewhere, and I always have Peter's in the moment use of the moment at hand, top of mind when I'm trying to navigate what's going on in the room.
Therefore, back to your earlier self-disclosure, you have to be really well in touch with your innards, as we said. You really would have to have that instant and introspective take on yourself at the same time you're helping others process that kind of somewhat troubling moment. And so it's tremendously important how balanced you are.
Well, it is a series of attempts. I'm not sure I am there or will ever get there, but is the combination of journaling, which is a regular practice of mine, meditation, which is a regular practice of mine, and then I weave in some physical practice. I've been a student of Tai Chi for a number of years. I'm an occasional yoga student, and so any personal reflection, personal awareness, personal insight practice typically helps keep me from getting detached from myself. And here we are in this virus period where, we're totally detached from the outside world. And
incredible detachment.
For me, it's a bit anxiety provoking, but it's also very comforting and very centering and very reassuring to know that there is this self that is the source that can endure whatever the world, whatever the virus confronts me with.
I would segue back to my third year that I hear Peter in this conversation, and he would first be I'm very happy to hear you and hear you say those things. And he'd say, well, let's talk about NTL, all kinds of great memories. But he'd also say that you take any kind of practice, he called it the big P in our manuscript and in our conversation, any kind, where you're no longer able to, where the circumstances pretty much counter any way that you could practice what you do, whether you're a plumber, whether you're a teacher, you name it. And he would say, but have you stopped being, even though your title was professor or whatever the company took away, or at least put on hold, was that really you?
Sure.
What's left is a lot. It's you. That's what's left. And you still have unborn capabilities. And maybe, as you just said, maybe the period of time for deep thought and reflection and just listening to the silence for a while would begin to have yourself produce some other what ifs and possibilities. So he was very much a believer in that. I remember one of his favorite lines that he quoted, and I think he attributed it to, well, I'll tell you, and then you might know who he attributed to: efficacy at the point of action. I think it might have been, I'm not much of a scholar in this memory, but it was one of the first most important things he said to me as I was finishing the program. Dissertation was almost ready to be approved, and I was struggling whether I would go forward as a practitioner or choose the academic path. I had a PhD that could have taken me either way, and I was only 30 years old. And so I asked Peter in the lounge at the business school at UConn, Peter, help me, just give me something to wrap my head around about organization behavior, because I have so many thoughts that they're like a bunch of bees buzzing around. And he said, efficacy at the point of action. He said, if you believe in that, if you believe that people can be effective in the moment when they're about to have to deliver something, whether it's a golf stroke to get to the green or whatever it is, that's where it all comes together. That's where that whole person is poised to take action. And then, of course, the other piece is, and afterwards they learn. Did it work? Did it not work? How do you tweak it? So
Sure.
Tell me a little bit more about your time with Peter. I mean, you were his student, but did you keep in touch at all in the ensuing years?
Yes. I'll just preface this by saying I had two kind of prevailing impressions of Peter. One was that he was totally present to me when I was with him. I felt like there was nothing else important except me to him. And that was the most reaffirming feeling. And the other was that there was a deep, rich inner life in Peter that maybe those who knew him better would have access to, but I knew that was not for me. That was Peter's, that was kind of behind his persona. And I was also struck with the strength and power of his hands. I loved watching his hands. We were at a conference in 1993. The OD Network had a future search up at Lake Geneva in Wisconsin, and the network at the time had been run by a practitioner, part-time, and a retired couple. And the question and the membership was starting to get up around 2,500, starting to get substantial. And the question on the table was, should we hire a professional association manager and move from Portland to New York? And so we spent the 2.5 days on the future search there. I was the youngest guy in the room. Maybe I was 32 or 35. And so my job was to walk. Kathy Dannemiller was one of the participants, and she had done a lot of work at Ford Motor, and particularly on labor matters and on socio-technical systems. But she was losing her sight. So my job was to walk her from building to building at this campsite so that she could get around. So we were always the last people leaving the room. and the last people arriving in the room. And so in those conversations, I would often run into Peter. It was quite striking to me how he had such an orthogonal perspective about what had just happened in the last half day to my own. He was seeing things that I could not fathom. He was seeing and observing and interpreting things that were way the hell over my head. So that was,
you're only 32. You
well,
might have
that's
had a
true.
couple of years on you,
That's true.
but I get exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Right. There was a perceptiveness and a depth to his understanding that I encounter in very few people even today. The other thing I noticed about him was that we were kind of isolated off at this campsite, and but there was a piano in the room.
Yeah.
Peter Peter entertained us for both nights we were there.
Yeah.
Peter could play any song he'd ever heard in any key he'd ever played it in. And if somebody said, "Oh, play Swanee River," and it started in the wrong key, somebody would say, "Oh, I need it higher," and he'd play it higher. I mean, he was unbelievable.
He loved that.
His piano playing.
He truly, truly loved that. That's how many people remember him in the organization Behavior Teaching Society.
Yeah.
Because we'd have these night around beer kind of sessions and always a piano. And Peter, that was in my early days, he would sit down and I would, when is he going to run out of songs? And I asked him many years later, and he said, I never run out. I always paid attention to any kind of lyric, melody, you name it. And he says, and you fake it a little bit until you make it. But I think that's talk about metaphors. I mean, his piano playing and the way he used that and particularly to entertain himself. He missed a lot about when he couldn't play that anymore. He loved sailing. He probably mentioned that when you're out there in Wisconsin.
Sure.
He was an excellent sailor from what Hammerly has told me. He an award-winning sailor in that particular class of sailboat that sailed on those lakes out in Minnesota, and then he sailed at Chesapeake Bay when he was out here. All those practices, which he called them in a very almost devoted way, the practices that helped him become Peter Vale as we know him. I once asked him, "Is there a crossover, Peter? When you were sailing, are you thinking how you could use this in some of your lessons?" And he said, "No, it's not quite that simple."
No, that's right. No, that's one of the ways I really appreciated his thinking. He was not a simple thinker. Mm-mm. He was able to exist in many different realms without forcing any one into the other. Two other quick Peter stories. So it was one of the things I used to do for the OD network is I used to write a daily journal about kind of what's happened at the network. Mm-hmm. And I'm forgetting where we were in 2001, but it was just after Peter's surgery had gone bad.
That was in September 2001. Yeah.
Right. And so he was there in a wheelchair. And it was also the time that Kathy Dannemiller was in a wheelchair. And there was a moment, and this was before phones had cameras, there was a moment where the two of them, these two lions of the field, were sitting knee to knee in their wheelchairs, talking in the most intimate, sweet, and tender way from where I was sitting farther away. And I wish to this day, 19 years later, I wish to this day I'd had a picture of that because it was so powerful. I had a deep love for both of them in separate ways.
I can tell.
And to see these two lions of our field reduced, in one sense,
physically,
certainly so vulnerable, was such a sweet and tender and sad moment.
Yeah, that must have been one of those memories you're not going to let go ever. So it's recorded up here anyway.
Other story I'll tell you is my first meeting with Peter was I was working at the World Bank, which was about 3 blocks from George Washington, and We thought we were hot shit at the World Bank, and for the most part we were, but I was a young 31-year-old snot and applied to the PhD program there, maybe 32, just after I'd gotten my master's. Applied to the PhD program there, and Peter was the head of the department or chair of the committee or something like that. And so I just figured, this is going to be a gimme. I'm right next door. It's the World Bank. Everybody, the World Bank is hot shit. And I got a call from his assistant saying, Peter would like you to come over. I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to get. Peter's
going to put the doctorate right around your neck.
Exactly right. So I get in, and Peter's office was always a mess. Books all over the place. And he had to clear a chair to clear the book so I could sit down. He said, listen, I'm so glad you applied to our program, and I have such bad news for you. But he said, it's really good news. I said, bad news, good news? Okay. He said, the bad news is we're not going to take you as a student. I mean, there was no bullshit. There was no preamble. The bad news is we're not going to take you as a student. And the reason we're not going to take you as a student is because you have no depth as a scholar. He said, all of your depth is in practice, not in scholarship.
Oh,
I know. And, he was so right. He was exactly right. And when I later encountered him in my own doctoral program, we were graduating pracademics. We weren't graduating scholar practitioners. We were graduating pracademics. And there was a better fit for me than their program in the management school at the time in the mid 80s.
That's incredible. Actually, to get that kind of news and think of it as one of your better memories. But I can see him. He wasn't going to waste your time.
Nope.
If he had to wedge you in.
Yeah, no BS.
You would soon find out exactly what that meant because he knew the other faculty. He might have been able to give you quite a bit of latitude to be you, but I think he knew also that there was a crowd there that had a different idea of what rigor meant.
One other Peter thing, and that is his focus on practice the last 15 years, I think has a lot to do with Stephen Brookfield. Stephen wrote the Reflective Practice. I'm pretty sure Stephen wrote the Reflective Practice.
Don Schoen, wasn't it?
Don Schoen, right.
Yeah. Oh, he loved that book.
Yeah, exactly. And Brookfield wrote something similar.
Yeah.
Maybe built on that. And Brookfield was on the faculty at St. Thomas, I think around the time Peter was, or maybe it was after. But I can see Schoen's influence on Peter, and I think Peter kind of extended all that and took it farther than Don Schoen had in mind at the time. I think Don Schoen was really interested in the inner life of the practitioner, and Peter was interested in the active life of the practitioner.
There's that word again.
What are you going to do with it?
There you go. He loved that word "do."
Yeah, exactly.
He meant that fully. He meant it's not either or, of course, as you know, Matt. It's what are you going to do with yourself?
Yes.
And the key word was do. But this has been a really rich conversation. I'm afraid I have to, call the time on it in a moment. But I just am delighted to have met you. Hopefully, when we get off camera, it won't be the last time we talk. I realize there's a lot of change in the OD world, and it's shrinking, but there are a lot of people out there who still are going to be very puzzled about how to re-knit human connections when it's over. So I think there's plenty of work ahead. So that'll be my last question of you. What do you see ahead for you? So
I'm consulting. I've got most of my work the last 10 years have been large strategy and structure projects. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be 3, 4, 5 years long. We enter at some point, we enter on structure or business process or strategy, and then we work our way kind of up or down. So to kind of the way I think of it, the drivers are strategy, structure, business process, leadership development, and culture. And so we enter somewhere, and if there's appetite, we work up or down from wherever we enter. And so I've just finishing up my tour at American University, and I also have a small coaching practice. I take on one big problematic executive a year, And I've got some coaching going on and a couple of org design projects. The other thing that makes it work for me is I always reach out to my students and former students and have them work on the projects so that that way the scope of the project can expand beyond what I can do. And so that's always a feature of the work that I do.
So as long as you find that gratifying.
Yeah, so it's magnificent.
I would suspect it is, and a tremendous amount of variety.
Yes, variety, excitement, different challenges, different organizations, different students, different settings. The variety is quite appealing.
I'm very happy for you.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording. We'll say a couple of words afterwards, but thank you. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure, David. Thank you so much.